started working with Linux in about 1992.
Originally we wrote the code because we needed it.
The idea of building a kernel really captured the imagination.
You really want to sell just another set of proprietary
software. We're not going away. We're not getting any less aggressive.
We're an open source company, and we're not going to walk away from that just to make money.
Open source is not new. The whole software business effectively was no business. And in the beginning it was selling hardware, and to run the hardware you needed some sort of software. But nobody cared about software. Nobody cared about licensing or selling software. That came later with standardization, commoditization of the hardware, where people could exchange software between machines. Now let's go back to these times, 1985, 1980, and there is this smart hacker called Richard Matthew Stallman, RMS, and he's at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and effectively he's walking around the MIT and is a real hacker in the good old sense of hacker. At that time, the hacker was the guy who sneaked into the office of the professor, hacking into his room to get access to the terminal that would connect him to the type-sharing system.
Hey, look, test papers.
That's where the term hacker originally comes from. Richard Matthew Stallman, he created the Free Software Foundation, the GNU General Public License, which nowadays rules a lot of free software out there. And effectively saying, I don't want software vendors to make a divide between users and developers. If I like software, I must be able to give it to anyone and share it.
Richard Stallman was the youngest kid profiled in Stephen Levy's book. He was called Little Richard Stallman by the elders of that AI lab. Now, Richard Stallman is the great guru of the free software movement. He was a mentor to me, so that shows you where I was on the, on the genealogy of this whole movement. It was that time in the late 80s, early 90s, where if you wanted something, you built it. And then if you wanted something really special, you shared it.
The GPL caught on, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. It was promulgated by the Free Software Foundation, and in particular by Richard Stallman with help from Eben Moglen. Copyright tells you you have the right to restrict others from copying your work, from modifying your work, from distributing your work. The GPL says, hey, we're going to give you the right to copy it, and we're going to give you the right to modify it, and we're going to give you the right to distribute it. And the only requirement we've got is that if you do distribute it, you have to do it under this same license agreement. And that way we ensure that the same benefit that you derived out of GPL licensed software, you're extending to other parties.
I first ran into the GPL, which is the license, the GNU public license, in the late 80s actually, in England. And it kind of struck a chord in me, but I didn't really get a chance to actually do open source code full time until after I came to the US. And the first job where I was doing really open source and getting paid for it was when I joined Cygnus, which is Mike Tiemann's old company that you guys ended up buying.
I actually remember that there was quite a stir when Richard Stallman announced Project GNU and the GPL. I remember people debating whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, whether it could possibly work or not possibly work, and I remember that there was this thing going on. And I learned about the GNU Emacs editor, and I was astounded at the idea that something so rich and featureful would be available with source code. And I actually started reading the source code of Emacs. I was always interested in compilers. I excelled at the kind of math and at the kind of study that was related to compilers, and I began to form in my mind the idea that I was going to write the great American compiler. And on my birthday in 1987, Richard Stallman releases the GNU C compiler. And I could have seen that as the glass being shattered, not even half empty, but just all the water gone out. Or I could look at that as the glass completely full. Here is a world-class base of software that I could contribute to, and I didn't need to worry about working for a company or licensing it. And that was one of the first times I really began to feel that not only is this a lot of fun, but the amount of value that could be unlocked by free software was amazing.
This is the innovation of Michael Tiemann, that he realized, he read the GPL, which is a very strange document if you first read it. It's basically this software license going in about evil software hoarders and stuff. And Mike Tiemann's genius was realizing this is a business model. And that really was the innovation that kind of founded Cygnus and ultimately Red Hat, I think.
Nobody wanted to start the business because while they all thought it was a great idea, they thought it would never work. And after hearing that for 2 years, that's when I had my crucial insight. If everybody thought it was a great idea, then I was convinced that the capitalistic system would find a way to value it. And if nobody thought it would work, I realized I'd have no competition.
By default, everything was proprietary. So, you know, if you wanted to do open source work professionally, Cygnus was literally the only company there was. There was no, you know, it wasn't like you could do open source work and work for anybody else.
The goal of the company was to prove that this business model was as good as any model that had ever been imagined for software, not just in terms of profitability, but just overall sustainability. One of the things that made this whole free software thing work is that it was not dependent on the single individual. When Linus Torvalds sent out his message, his famous message about, hey, I'm working on an operating system, it's not going to be professional like GNU, obviously this idea of building a kernel really captured the imagination, and his timing was perfect.
And he wanted to call it Freaks, F-R-E-A-X. So he created a directory called Freaks, and he wanted to upload the source code there. And the system administrator of that FTP server said, this is a stupid name. This is really complete bullets. So let's rename it. Your Linux, let's call it Linux. And that's how the name Linux was invented. Which leads me to the 3 fundamental theories of the whole IT industry. It all happened by accident. It was done by amateurs, and nothing's really changed.
In early 1995, I got a call from one of my friends who was still working at Sun Microsystems, and he told me that there was this little company in North Carolina that was doing some really amazing stuff. And at the time, they maybe had a dozen, 15 people, but they had done something really new with free software. I could sense there was something interesting. And so I brought my 2 co-founders together and I said, you know what, I think we ought to do an acquisition. I think we should take 10% of our equity and buy them. And I did not make the sale. 5 years later, they took 10% of their equity and bought us. In some ways, being acquired by Red Hat was a redemption because the people at Red Hat were believers. When I met Bob Young, I knew that Bob had seen the same vision I had. Bob had the good fortune to build that vision around a Linux distribution, which has major scalable benefits over something like a compiler toolchain.
I was a big skeptic. When I first ran into Linux, 91, 92, I was a big skeptic. I didn't think it could go anywhere. It was just filling a void while you waited for a real operating system to show up on the new 486 machines. But I'm an old typewriter sales guy. And I look after customers, one customer at a time. And what I could see in this Linux thing is I had something to sell that if I found the right customer, he could not get from anyone else on the planet, no matter how big they were. Mark, working out of his spare bedroom down here in North Carolina, over in Durham, was doing a Linux distribution, which he named after his missing grandfather's lacrosse cap. In fact, in the very first version of his first release, in the opening of the manual, he told the story of this red lacrosse cap he used to wear between classes, and he says, if you're in the Philadelphia area and you find my lacrosse cap, I'd be grateful if you'd return it to me. By the way, to this day, I believe that's the only bug Red Hat's not been able to track down. We go back and forth. They say, well, Mark, you know, a couple of my customers say your distribution's better than other people's, and so, you know, I'm selling 1,000 copies a month of various Linux distributions. I should be able to sell 100 of yours, so send me 3 months supply, you know, send me 300 copies. Dead silence at the end of the phone. So I finally get out of Mark that he was only thinking of printing 300 copies. Well, I knew how little I was paying him for these copies. So we realized we had a match made in heaven. I needed a product and he needed some marketing help. So we ended up merging our little businesses, my ACC Corp, with his sole proprietorship.
We actually dug up that first purchase order of yours too.
Holy cow! That's unbelievable. And that's actually my handwriting.
Is it?
That is my handwriting.
So it's certified authentic.
It is certified. I can vouch for this. There is no question. We're sort of even somewhat nervous about being able to qualify for office space. Would a landlord who had office space rent it to a company who had no money in the bank and whose business was selling free software? And we just looked at it and go, ooh, you know, I'm not sure I want to fill out that application. There are very few companies that ever started being properly funded from the start that were ever successful. Because the concept of a startup is you very much focus what you spend money on to ensure you get value from it. It becomes part of your culture when you have no money.
My first encounter with Red Hat was at one of the early conferences in North Carolina. It was 2 small rooms and we had an immediate kind of walk through, meet everybody in 30 seconds. And the second time I went back it was a good deal bigger. And they were running out of space and they got more space. But they still had very much I suppose the kind of the tech culture of pre-NASDAQ crash. There were things like a budget for Nerf guns and shooting the management was considered obligatory.
So fast forward, we're now in the spring of '98. I'm now sitting on a business that Intel wants to partner with, that some of the top VCs in Silicon Valley want to partner with. I think I might need some help at this. We had a smart team, but we did not have a lot of senior industry experience. No, let me revise that. We didn't have any senior industry experience, which is actually part of our secret. Because we had no industry experience, we didn't fall into the bad habits of the industry. It is precisely what allowed us to rethink how the industry should work. I'm talking to Bill Kaiser at Greylock, who is still on the Red Hat board and who deserves a huge amount of respect for his contribution to Red Hat's success over the last 10 years. Bill, you know, we need some help. We need some high-level help. I don't want to hire a VP sales. I want to bring in the guy who might scale to be the CEO of this thing. Who do you know in North Carolina? He says, well, it's a little complicated because he's gainfully employed as the president of a software company that has intentions of going public. So I don't think he has any interest in talking to you, but I can always make the introduction because maybe he knows someone. And of course, it's Matthew Zulik. And my line was, hey Matthew, do you really want to sell just another set of proprietary software to another set of faceless corporate buyers? Or do you want to come and help us actually reinvent the software industry and materially improve how our society functions by empowering engineers to do the right thing with software and gain true transparency?
Look at the brand that this company has on a global basis. And the industry, our industry, is just starting around open source software.
We continue to want to make information accessible to all people.
It's very emotional to think that every day more and more people buy into that vision of creating a defining company of the 21st century.
Matthew very much was the right guy for Red Hat.
In some sense, Red Hat really hit the lottery with their IPO. And one of the things that happened with that IPO is it really did catapult Red Hat into a position where we had brand equity that was far beyond anything that either our revenues justified or really that we could have ever imagined.
It was still very much in the peak of the dot-com era, and we were able to go public at a valuation that just dwarfed the size of our company at the time. And it was a pretty exciting moment, there's no question. We came back to Red Hat after being up in New York and doing the road show and being in Goldman Sachs' office when it started to trade. And, we went out at $14 and it ended up the first day at $44. And everyone was all excited, and I go, well, I guess it's better than going out at 14 and ending up at $10.
When Red Hat was created, the whole business around Linux was just starting. So people were building distributions and sharing them or trying to sell them and etc. And Red Hat went into a mode that I would call the heroin phase. We were sort of drug dealers.
That's right, kid. 15 bucks. You gotta hold me for a while.
Every 6 months you get a fresh shot of Linux. Nice new box, nice new logo, new manual, new CDs, all wonderful. You know, we created a lot of articles and journalists reporting about it because our revenue model was quite simple: sell boxes.
Matthew Zilla kept talking to us about, we got to get away from the box product. And we're all going, that's the only place where we make any money right now. And it was hard to understand what he was telling us at that time. You know, in retrospect, it's like, oh yeah, that made a lot of sense. At the time, not so much.
The problem started to creep in from the beginning. People that run professional systems, business critical systems, will not update their systems every 6 months. What we did with Red Hat Enterprise Linux from 2002 is saying, dear customer, you're not buying boxes anymore. What you now buy is the right to use our software in whatever version that we produce during the runtime of your subscription, which is 1 or 3 years.
We retired our most successful product. We retired Red Hat Linux. There were lots of other ideas thrown around on how to do the subscription model. Everything from, should we have a proprietary installer, to should we have the whole thing proprietary?
One of the themes that we kept coming back to in that process is, we're an open source company and we're not going to walk away from that just to make money.
But because we did it in a very much free software way, we were able to keep the faith with the community, which I think is something that some of the other companies stumbled on, because they didn't make stuff like source code generally available. They didn't have community distributions in parallel.
We're the first ones to go into that subscription model. Every other software company on the planet would love to have been in a subscription model. Now, we had the advantage, we were starting with a clean sheet of paper because we didn't really have any revenue back then.
The benefit of the subscription model is you start spreading the receipt of the money and the recognition of the revenue that you received over the period of time that you're actually maintaining that software.
We knew the risk we were taking. We absolutely bet the farm on doing that and getting into the enterprise market. By retiring Red Hat Linux, spawning RHEL, then Fedora, continuing to give the community in the open source world that completely free operating system that they wanted and that actually drove everything we did, while at the same time having a vehicle like RHEL that we needed to make money to continue to fuel the company on. If we didn't do RHEL, the company wouldn't be here right now. If we didn't do Fedora, the company wouldn't be here right now.
So one important thing that we had to do when we moved from a box product company to an enterprise software company is really rethink, how do we go to market from a legal paper perspective? There's 1,000 different license agreements out there, but what we were doing was not creating a software license agreement. We had the general public license that was our software license agreement, and we had to create a recurring revenue model agreement for software, and that had never really been done before. We didn't have any models to follow. One of the really important things that we knew we had to do to have credibility with the enterprise customers that we wanted to serve was to have applications from independent software vendors certified, ported to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and certified to run on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So we had to create a desire in those ISVs to self-certify on our platform. And we also had to create a program that companies would be interested in participating in order to self-certify.
Really from the day one when I joined the company, I tried to build a global business. So not just separate countries and separate regions, but people communicating, working together. I started with Europe, really building in European operations. So our European operations, those days were in Germany, in France, and in UK. That's it. We started operations in Benelux countries, Scandinavia. We started in Eastern Bloc or former Eastern Bloc countries. We really cover now the entire European business, and it grew substantially. Asia Pacific was the next, and our primarily business was at the very beginning in Japan. So we expanded the Asia Pacific business to China, to Korea, to India. We expanded our Australian business, and we entered ASEAN countries. So, and now we really cover the entire Asia Pacific. About 3 years ago, we acquired our partner in Latin America. And this business in Latin America grew rather dramatically. We have a fantastic team, and the business grew in thousands of %. Still from the smaller base, but we're really becoming a true global company, which is a good thing to see.
Welcome to the New York Stock Exchange. There is a real buzz and excitement around here this morning because we have the privilege to welcoming to our family of listed companies Red Hat, the world's leading open source and Linux provider.
It's a great day for Red Hat. To be listed on the New York Stock Exchange is kind of an honor, and it's where the big established companies are.
I think customers and competitors and partners saw that and said, wow, these guys are for real, and they've arrived. You know, there were 2 acquisitions that I think were also inflection points for the company. JBoss is the first one. If we were going to grow the platform, we really needed a world-class runtime environment. We really needed a world-class development environment on top of that. And so that was the impetus for us to go out and bring JBoss in. They built a great community, they built a great brand, they built a great set of products, and we felt that the combination of that with the operating system would be killer.
You know, what we've tried to do is either join, successful projects or be a steward of new projects to try to point, the open source model at new areas that enterprise need. And so application space was a natural to be able to, there's a lot that can happen if you can get worldwide collaboration around, a Java development platform.
A really talented bunch in Israel started the KVM project, and we watched that very intently. And what we saw was, what we felt was an architecturally superior next generation virtualization. We really saw it as a next generation, a loadable module into the kernel that can inherit all the goodness of the operating system as opposed to a separate layer and a separate operating system.
Open source has moved from being, the domain of a few techies and a few early adopters to truly being ubiquitous. Gartner today says that the majority of enterprise products will include open source components. Now, as we move forward, I certainly expect that in software to continue to move up the stack and broaden out into other categories. If you look at clouds will be open source, clouds will run open source. So we are at a fundamental tipping point where computing will be forever changed by the power of open source. OpenSource.com is a key initiative inside of Red Hat, and I think we have proven the power of participation in software with open source. What I want to do is take those learnings and make sure we can apply them to other areas of human endeavor, be those academic research, be that healthcare, be that government and participation in government, be that our legal system. There's so many opportunities where knowledge building upon knowledge can be valuable.
Basically what we're finding is that if you look at the open source way as a way of thinking about approaching problems, a way of solving problems, a way of dealing with the world around you in a different way, that you can apply the open source way in all of those facets, and what you will get is a result that's different than if you approached it in a more traditional way.
It's everywhere. I mean, you look at the growth of open source inside, some of the, more risk-averse environments like the federal government. The open source use and, the Red Hat business inside the U.S. federal government is blossoming. Now it's really less around open source and more about, the solutions that open source has built.
So what we found running open source technology is there's so many eyes on the code. It's a collaborative community that we've found they're very robust. They're quite stable and they're quite secure, and well, like any code, there may be vulnerabilities, but they're discovered fast and they're patched fast. So that means in my vulnerability testing, the open source technologies always fare very well. Now, unless we have the trust of the patient, it's really hard to share data. So I find that open source and the resulting security is foundational to healthcare technology. If you're the steward of your data and you decide who should see what, when, in what context, it's patient-centered, it's protecting privacy and confidentiality. That's really the way healthcare should run.
This whole concept of sharing, of participatory democracy, if you would, that's embodied in open source software, has started to have an impact on other aspects of our lives. So out of this you had the Creative Commons, which started into sharing content.
So free culture refers to a balance of encouragement and freedom for people over their own culture. There are protections like copyright necessary in what I think of as a free culture, but they're limited and balanced to make sure that they do nothing more than give the incentive they need to creators to create and leave the rest of culture as free as possible.
These three big things, open source, open standards, and open content, and they together form the fundament for the new society that we're seeing nowadays everywhere.
The community values of free software are incredibly important, and the ability to make things happen all over the world.
There are many organizations and non-profits in India who believe that the usage of open source is absolutely essential to bridge the digital divide, take computing to the masses, and democratize the use of technology in a country like India. So there are organizations which are trying to promote the usage of open source software in education. We have close to 250 million children who need to be educated. Now, if you want to put proprietary software on the computers that you give to these children, the cost of education becomes exorbitant.
You look at things like one laptop per child, or universities in second and kind of better third world countries, all of a sudden can afford really afford to use software and buy software.
Of course we care about the software, but we care about the world in which we live as well. We care about everything.
If you get it right, if you're able to drive some good changes, it's not just a small localized this, but it has a phenomenal effect on a lot of people.
Open source as a methodology, as a culture, it really permeates everything that we do here at Red Hat.
And so it's very important to me to be a part of something, not only building an institution, but something that really matters. It matters not just to our shareholders, but more broadly to the communities we're in. And Red Hat fits that mission, right? We truly do have a mission to change the world.